News at 6 today, the investigation continues into the murders of legendary actor, producer, and director Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle.
Imagine their fear, betrayal, heartbreak as they were aware of what the son they loved was doing to them. The world is asking why, but the answer was already screaming in the crowded halls of Conan O'Brien's Christmas party. While the headlines focus on the Sunday tragedy, it is the shocking details from that Saturday night gathering that reveal what really happened between Rob and Nick Reiner. Before the silence of the crime scene, there was a public explosion. A final desperate argument witnessed by Hollywood's elite that signaled the end of a dynasty. Saturday night, the annual Christmas party at Conan O'Brien's estate. This wasn't just a mixer, it was a sanctuary. Conan, with his innate understanding of the industry's pulse, creates a space where the most famous people on earth can drop their guard. The air was filled with the smell of pine, expensive scotch, and the easy laughter of old friends. But the moment the heavy oak doors opened to admit Rob, Michelle, and Nick Reiner, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Rob Reiner walked in wearing the smile the world knows, the warm, benevolent grin of the man who directed The Princess Bride. But looking closer through the lens of omniscience, we can see the cracks in the porcelain. He wasn't there to celebrate. He was there to perform the most difficult role of his life, the father in control. He was desperately trying to reintegrate his son into the fold, hoping that the magic of Hollywood could cure the rot in Nick's soul. But Nick Reiner was no longer reading from the same script. With a shaved head and eyes that scanned the room like a security camera recording a crime in progress, Nick moved through the crowd not as a guest, but as an intruder. He was an entity of antimatter in a universe of stars. He drifted toward Bill Hader, a comedian known for his sharp wit and kindness, but Nick didn't offer a handshake, he offered a violation of the social contract. "What is your name? Are you famous?" The questions hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Nick wasn't asking because he didn't know. He was asking because he wanted to dismantle the reality his father cherished. He was looking at the titans of his father's world and reducing them to nothingness. It was a calculated act of psychological aggression, a way to show Rob that his legacy meant nothing to the son who was about to destroy it. Rob watched this from across the room, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was terrified. He saw the psychopath eyes locking onto his friends, assessing them, dismissing them. The hushed elegance of the party was shattered not by a punchline but by a shout. The argument between Rob, Michelle, and Nick didn't happen in a private corner. It spilled out into the open, a raw wound exposed to the salt air. The guests, people who had known Rob for 40 years, stopped mid-sentence. They saw the meathead they loved shrink physically. They saw Michelle, usually the pillar of strength, looking around with the frantic eyes of a trapped animal. Conan O'Brien, standing at the edge of the fray, witnessed the tragedy before the crime. He didn't see a family squabble. He saw a hostage situation. He saw Rob Reiner, a man who could command entire film crews, looking utterly powerless against the gravitational pull of his son's darkness. In the aftermath of the shouting, Rob whispered a confession to a close friend that now echoes like a premonition. He didn't say, "Nick is having a bad night." He whispered, "I'm scared. I don't know what he's going to do next." It was a cry for help that dissolved into the festive music. When the Reiners finally turned to leave, the silence that followed them out the door was heavier than any applause Rob had ever received. They walked to their car, a family unit in name only. Rob and Michelle were getting into a vehicle with a ticking time bomb, leaving the safety of the lights behind. As they drove away from Conan's house, disappearing into the Los Angeles night, they weren't just going home. They were driving into the abyss. The party was over. The witnesses were left behind. And now there was no one left to protect them from the passenger in the back seat. If Saturday night was the cacophony of the warning, Sunday morning was the silence of the aftermath. The sun rose over Brentwood as it always does, bright, indifferent, illuminating the manicured lawns and the high gates of the elite. To the outside observer, the Reiner estate looked exactly as it had for decades, a fortress of success, a sanctuary for a Hollywood legend. But the stillness that hung over the property wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a tomb. Inside, the time for arguments was over. The time for chemical battles was finished. There was only the static of a life interrupted. The first crack in the silence didn't come from a siren, but from a mundane appointment. A massage therapist arrived at the gate, expecting to be buzzed in F. Or a routine session with Rob and Michelle. It was the kind of normal, everyday event that anchors a wealthy life. But when she pressed the intercom, there was no answer. She called the house line. Nothing. She called their cell phones. They rang into the void. Sensing a disturbance in the rhythm of the day, the therapist made the call that would change history. She didn't call the police. She called Romy Reiner. Roy, the daughter, lived just across the street. For years, that proximity had been a blessing, a symbol of a tight-knit family where Sunday visits were just a few steps away. But on this Sunday, that closeness became a curse. Romy didn't wait, she didn't ask questions. She ran. Imagine the frantic heartbeat of a daughter sprinting across the asphalt of a quiet suburban street, her mind racing through 1,000 innocent explanations, trying to outrun the one terrible truth she could feel in her gut. She arrived at the house with a roommate, breathless, hoping to find her parents sleeping or perhaps arguing or maybe just ignoring the world. But when she stepped through the door, the house didn't feel like home anymore. The New York Times reporting confirms the sequence of horror. Romy moved through the silent hallways, the familiar scent of her childhood home now tainted by a metallic, terrifying reality. She found her father first. We will not describe the graphic nature of what she saw, but the reaction tells us everything we need to know. Romy didn't stay, she didn't try to wake him. The finality of the scene was so absolute, so shattering that the instinct to survive kicked in. She ran back out of the house, collapsing onto the driveway, gasping for air in a world that had suddenly run out of oxygen. The most heartbreaking detail, the one that leaves a scar on everyone, is that Romy ran out before she found her mother. It wasn't until the paramedics arrived, their sirens finally piercing the Brentwood calm, that Romy learned the full extent of the annihilation. A first responder had to walk back down that driveway and tell a weeping daughter that Michelle was gone, too. In the span of 20 minutes, Romy Reiner went from being a neighbor to an orphan. But as the yellow tape went up and the detectives began their grim walkthrough, a single piece of evidence screamed louder than any witness. There was no forced entry. The windows were intact. The heavy front doors hadn't been kicked in. The alarm hadn't been tripped by an intruder. This detail is the pivot point of the entire investigation. It shifts the narrative from a random tragedy to a domestic betrayal. It confirms what Rob Reiner feared most in his final moments at Conan's party. The monster wasn't waiting outside the gate. The monster had a key. The killer didn't need to break in because he was already home. The sanctuary of the bedroom where Rob and Michelle were found had been violated, not by a stranger, but by the person they had tucked into bed 1,000 times. The lack of broken glass was the final proof that their love had been their undoing. They had left the door open for their son, and he had walked through it to end them. As the sun began to set on Sunday, the Reiner estate was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, and Romy Reiner was left standing on the other side of the police line, staring at the house, where only a silence remained that would last forever. While Romy Reiner was collapsing in the driveway of the Brentwood estate, a secondary timeline was unfolding 15 miles to the east. A timeline that would become the most controversial piece of evidence in the entire investigation. The public expected a manhunt for a monster. They imagined a suspect fleeing in a high-speed chase, erratic screaming, perhaps covered in the visual evidence of his rage. The narrative being spun by the defense was one of insanity. A mind so broken by schizophrenia and chemical imbalance that it no longer understood cause and effect. But the surveillance footage recovered by the lab tells a different story. It presents a comparison that is harder to stomach than any horror movie. The contrast between the brutality of the act and the boredom of the escape. At a gas station near the intersection of Exposition Boulevard and Vermont Avenue, a busy, grimy cross-section of Los Angeles, far removed from the manicured lawns of Brentwood, cameras captured Nick Reiner. He wasn't running, he wasn't hiding his face in shame, he was shopping. The footage shows a man wearing a black and green jacket, a baseball cap pulled low but not suspiciously so, and a bright red backpack. He strolls through the aisles at a leisurely pace. He pauses at the beverage cooler, he deliberates. He selects a sports drink. He stands in line, he waits his turn. He pays with a credit card. Let that sink in. A man who has just allegedly committed the most unnatural act a human being can commit, ending the lives of the parents who gave him everything, is capable of standing patiently in Lee. Need for a Gatorade, he interacts with the cashier. The employee later reported that he seemed entirely normal, polite even. A psychotic break usually results in chaos. But this was dissociation weaponized. It suggests a mind that had compartmentalized the horror, locked it away in a box, and returned to the mundane tasks of survival. He had the presence of mind to leave the crime scene. He had the cognitive ability to navigate the complex Los Angeles public transit system. Remember, Nick didn't drive. To get from Brentwood to Exposition Park requires transfers, planning, and patience. He didn't wander aimlessly, he commuted. The investigation tracked him to a hotel in Santa Monica before he moved east. And here the behavior shifts from mundane to methodical. Reports indicate that upon checking in, Nick didn't just collapse, he hung sheets over the windows. Why, if he was lost in a delusion, why was he worried about being seen? Covering the windows is an act of evasion. It implies a consciousness of guilt. He knew the world would be looking for him. He knew helicopters would soon be circling. He was creating a bunker. Forensic experts believe this window of time was used for a cleanup. The red backpack likely contained the clothes he wore during the event. The shower in the hotel room likely washed away the DNA evidence. This wasn't a man in a fugue state. This was someone managing a crime scene. When the lapped narcotics unit finally cornered him based on intelligence from his past habits, the climax was anticlimactic. There was no shootout, there was no negotiation. Nick Reiner was found on foot alone. He surrendered without a fight. But the final twist lies in where he is now. He isn't in the general population of the LA County Jail. He has been placed in a specialized medical ward, isolated from other prisoners under 24/7 video monitoring. This isolation serves two purposes. First, it protects him from a prison population that might seek retribution for a high-profile parasite. But secondly, and more importantly, it is the stage for the legal battle to come. The defense will point to the medical ward and say, "See, he is sick, he belongs in a hospital." But the prosecution will point to the gas station video and say, "Look at him buying a drink, he knew exactly what he was doing." This chapter leaves us with a terrifying realization. The monster wasn't a frothing beast. The monster was a calm, polite customer standing in line at a convenience store, holding a secret that would soon break the heart of the world. The distance between Brentwood and Exposition Park is only 15 miles, but the psychological distance between the son Rob Reiner loved and the man in that video is infinite. While the public focuses on the timeline of the escape, the true story of what happened inside the Brentwood residence is being told by silent witnesses: physics and biology. Enter Mary Ellen Owl, a former FBI specialist whose career has been defined by reading the language of crime scenes. Her analysis shifts the narrative from what happened to why it happened that way. The absence of forced entry was the first psychological clue. It confirms the insider threat, but the specific nature of the trauma found on Rob and Michelle tells a much darker, more personal story. The official report cites multiple sharp force injuries. In the cold logic of profiling, this specific method signifies rage. Owl explains that this wasn't a distant act, it was up close and personal. This level of proximity requires a profound emotional connection between the aggressor and the victim. It suggests that the motive wasn't financial or incidental. It was an attempt to obliterate a relationship. The forensic term often used is overkill, when the energy expended far exceeds what is necessary to end a life. It is the physical manifestation of years of resentment boiling over. But the most compelling detail for the prosecution lies in a phenomenon known as slippage. Forensic science teaches us that when extreme force is applied in this manner, the laws of physics often turn against the aggressor. Without a specific type of protective guard, the hand wielding the instrument will almost inevitably slide, resulting in self-inflicted injuries. This creates the ultimate forensic trap: commingled biology. If Nick Reiner sustained injuries during the event, his biological markers wouldn't just be present at the scene, which could be explained away since he lived there. They would be mixed directly with the evidence of the tragedy. This biochemical handshake is irrefutable. It places him at the epicenter of the violence at the exact millisecond it occurred, destroying any defense theory that he came home and found them. Furthermore, the pattern of the scene dismisses the robbery theory entirely. Valuables were likely left untouched. The target wasn't the safe. The target was the people. The science confirms what the heart fears most. Rob and Michelle were not victims of opportunity. They were victims of a crime of passion, executed by someone who knew exactly where to find them in their most vulnerable state. As the yellow tape is finally peeled away from the gates of the Brentwood estate and the forensic trucks fade into the Los Angeles traffic, we are left with more than just a crime scene. We are left with a spiritual wound that may never fully heal. The forensic science tells us how it happened, but the comment section of this tragedy tells us why it hurts so much. One viewer wrote a sentence that cuts through every legal argument and every autopsy report: to give life to a person only to have them end you. That single line captures the ultimate devastating irony of Rob Reiner's life. Here was a man who spent decades creating life, breathing soul into characters like the grandfather in The Princess Bride, nurturing the dreams of young filmmakers and fighting for the future of America's children. He was a creator, a builder, a giver, and in the end, he was unmade by his own creation. This is the tragedy that the public cannot reconcile. It feels like a violation of the natural order. A parent is supposed to watch their child grow, not watch their child become the architect of their demise. The outrage we feel isn't just about the loss of a celebrity. It is about the betrayal of the most sacred contract in human existence, the bond between parent and child. Rob and Michelle Reiner didn't fail. They loved. They loved with a ferocity that perhaps blinded them to the danger standing in their own hallway. They proved that you can have all the money in the world, the best doctors, and the deepest compassion, but you cannot save a soul that has decided to dwell in the dark. The lesson from Brentwood is a harsh one. It reminds us that addiction and untreated mental illness are not just personal struggles. They are tsunamis that swallow entire families. It teaches us that sometimes the walls we build to keep the world out ultimately trap us with the danger inside. As we say goodbye to the man who taught us Stand By Me, let us not remember him for the violence of his final hour. Let us remember him for the decades of laughter and warmth he gave us. Let us remember Michelle for her endurance and her grace. The investigation will continue. The courts will debate sanity and intent, but the verdict in the court of public opinion is already in. This was a tragedy of love pushed beyond its limits. If this story moved you, if you feel the weight of this loss, please share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going, not about the crime, but about the people we lost. Please like and subscribe to help us honor their memory by telling their story with the truth and dignity they deserve. Rest in peace, Rob and Michelle. You gave us the world. We are so sorry the world couldn't save you.